The warning light had been blinking for 3 hours before Marcus Hale finally looked at it. He was eating a cold sandwich at the time, boots up on the control panel, staring at the ceiling of his small ship like it owed him money. The stubborn mule was a salvage tug. Old, dented, smelling faintly of burned wiring and engine grease. She was not a pretty ship, but she flew and she listened, and that was more than Marcus could say about most things in his life. He looked at the blinking light. Then he looked at his sandwich. Then back at the light. He put the sandwich down. The signal was coming from deep inside Sector Null, a part of space that no government claimed and no sane pilot visited. There were no trade lanes out here, no patrol ships, no rescue teams. If something went wrong in Sector Null, it stayed wrong. That was the rule everyone knew, but the signal was strong, and it was coded as a distress call. Marcus leaned forward in his chair and pulled up the data. The signal was broadcasting on a frequency he had never seen before. His computer took almost a full minute just to decode the language, which told him two things. First, whoever was out there was very far from home. Second, they were in serious trouble if they were broadcasting at all in a place like this. He sat with it for a moment. He was a practical man. He did not do things without reason, but he was also a man who had grown up fixing things, broken engine, cracked pipes, torn wires, and something in him could never quite ignore a thing that needed fixing. He turned the stubborn mule toward the signal and pushed the throttle forward. It took 40 minutes to reach the source. When he did, Marcus stopped the ship and just stared out the front window for a long time. He had seen big ships before. He had salvaged pieces of old warships, military cruisers, colony transports the size of city blocks, but the vessel floating in front of him was something else. It was enormous, dark hold built, with sharp angles and long sweeping lines that looked almost like the wings of some deep-sea creature. It was clearly a warship, clearly built by minds that thought very differently from human ones, and clearly in serious trouble. 3 of its main engine sections were venting bright plasma in long hissing streams that lit up the black of space like broken neon signs. The hull near the middle had buckled from what looked like some kind of internal explosion, and the whole ship was rotating very slowly, which meant the navigation system was offline, and no one inside was correcting it. Marcus looked at it for another moment. Then he opened a cargo locker, pulled out his tool belt, and started getting ready. Docking with a drifting ship of that size was not simple. It took careful work with the mule's positioning, thrusters, a lot of very focused breath holding, and one moment where Marcus quietly said a word he did not say in polite company. But the magnetic docking clamp caught, and the connection held, and he cut through the outer airlock with a portable cutter and stepped inside. The ship was dark. Emergency lighting, a dim red glow, ran along the floor in strips, just enough to see by. The air was thin and cold, and Marcus pulled his breather mask over his face as he moved forward. He could hear the hiss of escaping gas somewhere ahead, and the low groan of metal that was under more stress than it wanted to be. He followed the sound of the plasma leak first. The smell hit him before he rounded the corner. Hot metal and something like burned sugar, strange and sharp. The conduit was right there. Thick pipe as wide as his arm span, cracked along a seam and pouring bright superheated gas in a fan-shaped spray. Beyond it, 2 more conduits had failed. At their connection joints, Marcus crouched down and studied it. He opened his kit and went through what he had. Human engineer working on an alien ship, with alien parts and no manual. Most people would have turned around and left. Marcus found a long strip of heat bonding polymer, the kind meant for patching hull breaches, and started cutting it into sections. He worked fast. The polymer went over the crack, pressed hard, sealed with the bonding iron. Not elegant, not permanent, but solid enough. He moved to the connection joints next, using a combination of clamp fittings from his kit and a spray sealant he had honestly bought, mostly because it was on sale. It was not the kind of work that would make it into any textbook, but each hiss of escaping plasma quieted one by one until the corridor was silent. He stood up, stretched his back, and turned around. There was someone standing at the end of the corridor. She was tall, taller than any human woman he had ever seen, taller than most human men. Her skin was a deep blue-gray, the color of old iron, and her eyes were pale gold, almost luminous. In the red emergency light, she wore what looked like armor, black layered, covering her from shoulder to knee, but it was damaged, torn at the left side. There was dark blood on the edge of it, almost black in the dim light. She was watching him, not moving, not speaking. Marcus realized he was still holding the bonding iron. He lowered it slowly. Your plasma conduits were venting, he said. I patched them. 3 of them. The ship should stop rotating in a few minutes once pressure restabilizes. She said nothing. Her pale gold eyes moved to the pipes behind him, then back to him. I'm Marcus Hale, he said. I run a salvage and repair operation out of the Brennan station. I picked up your distress signal. Still nothing. Then finally, in a voice that was low and very controlled, she spoke. Her language came out as a series of sounds that meant nothing to him but his earpiece translator, old and a little glitchy, worked through it. After a moment, you sealed a Class 4 plasma breach with adhesive strips. It was not a question. It was said the way a person says something they have seen with their own eyes but cannot quite believe. It worked, didn't it? Marcus said. Her expression did not change. It was not the expression of someone who was impressed. It was the expression of someone who was deeply unsettled. Who are you? She said through the translator, and this time it was more careful, more deliberate, like she was testing the words. To board the Imperial vessel Velshara without permission. Marcus looked around at the patch pipes, the stabilizing ship, the thin but breathable air that was slowly improving as the pressure systems recovered. The person who kept your ship from tearing itself apart, he said. You can tell me who you are after the lights come back on. The lights, as it happened, came back on about 4 minutes later, and that was when Marcus Hale first saw the throne at the end of the main corridor and the golden crest above it, and understood in a slow and slightly uncomfortable way that the bleeding woman in damaged armor watching him from the shadows was not just any survivor. She was the queen. Her name was Cerebeth. Marcus learned this not from her directly, but from the tall, armored guard who appeared 2 hours after the lights came back on. The guard was clearly not happy about the human wandering around the ship. He made this clear with his posture, his expression, and the very large weapon he was carrying, which he kept pointed just slightly in Marcus's direction, not Quieted him, but close enough to make a point. He escorted Marcus to a large room near the center of the ship. Room was not a meeting room or a waiting area, it was a throne room. Marcus had never been in a throne room before, and he found the whole thing somewhat excessive given that the ship had nearly blown up an hour ago, but he kept that thought to himself. Queen Sarabeth was already seated when he arrived. She had changed out of the damaged armor into something cleaner, long dark robes with a high collar, a thin band of black metal across her forehead that he guessed was a crown of some kind. The wound on her side had been dressed. She sat very straight and very still, and her gold eyes followed him all the way across the room. Around her stood 6 members of her court, advisors or nobles of some kind. Marcus guessed all of them in various states of recovery. Some were pale, one was leaning on a staff, all of them were staring at Marcus with an expression that fell somewhere between confusion and disgust. He stopped a few feet from the throne. He did not bow. It was not that he was trying to be disrespectful, it simply did not occur to him. You are the one called Marcus. Hail, Sarabeth said through the translator. Her voice was flat and formal. That's right, he said. You are human, also right. One of the advisors made a small sound, something between a cough and a groan at his casual tone. Sarabeth did not react. You boarded an imperial vessel without clearance, she said. You touched systems belonging to the crown without authorization. You used, she paused just slightly, non-standard materials on Class 4 infrastructure, non-standard materials. That held, Marcus said. If you want, I can leave and unpatch them. There was a very long silence. 2 of the advisors exchanged looks that said quite clearly they could not believe what they were hearing. Sarabeth looked at him for a moment. Then she turned to an advisor and spoke in her own language. The advisor moved to a small console and returned with something, a flat panel with numbers on it. This is what you are owed for the repair work, Sarabeth said. Marcus looked at the number. It was generous, more than generous. Honestly, he did the quick math in his head. New engine parts for the mule, 3 months of docking fees, a few good meals. That works, he said. Sarabeth's chin lifted slightly. I will double it. Marcus blinked. What for? Because I am a queen, she said simply, and I do not pay minimum price for anything. Marcus considered this for about 2 seconds. All right, he said. I won't argue with that. He was about to ask the advisor about the payment transfer when Sarabeth spoke again. Her voice had changed slightly, still controlled, but with something underneath it that was harder to name. How did you know what to do? Marcus paused. What do you mean? The conduits, the seals. You came aboard a vessel you had never seen, built by a civilization you have clearly never encountered, using tools from your own small ship. Her gold eyes were steady on him. How did you know what to do? He thought about it honestly for a moment. I didn't know exactly, he said. I know how plasma conduits work in general. The physics doesn't change much species to species. Pressure, heat, flow. I could see where it was failing. The rest was just working with what I had. Your materials were inadequate for the task. My materials got the job done, Marcus said, and there was no argument in his voice, just a simple statement of fact. Back home there's a saying, you use what you've got, you don't wait for the perfect tool. You make the current tool work, Sarabeth Was quiet for a moment. The Kethori do not repair things that are broken, she said. When a component fails, it is removed and replaced with one that functions correctly. Repair implies imperfection. Imperfection is not acceptable in imperial systems. Marcus looked at her. So what happens to the broken parts? The ones you remove, they are discarded. He nodded slowly. Then you've been throwing away a lot of good things. The room went absolutely silent. It was the kind of silence that happened when something had been said that could not be unsaid. The advisors had gone rigid. The guard near the door had straightened up. Even the soft hum of the newly repaired ship system seemed to hold its breath. Sarabeth looked at Marcus with an expression he could not fully read. It was not anger, it was something more complicated, like a person who had been told something obvious that had somehow never occurred to them before, and did not yet know how to feel about it. She raised one hand. The advisors, the guards, the entire court moved to leave the room in complete silence. They filed out through the side doors, and within a minute the throne room held only two people. Sarabeth stood from the throne. She was even taller standing. She walked toward him slowly, stopping a few feet away, and studied him in the quiet way that made Marcus feel like a piece of machinery being evaluated. You are not afraid of me, she said. Should I be? Every being who has stood in this room has been afraid of me. It is the appropriate response, I'm sure. It is, Marcus said, but you're not going to hurt me. If you were, you would have had your guard do it when I first came through the airlock. You let me patch your ship. You paid me. You asked me a question. He paused. People who are about to hurt you don't ask questions. She was quiet for a long moment. The gold eyes did not leave his face. You see things plainly, she finally said. It's a habit, he said. Ships don't care about rank. Engines don't respond to titles. Things either work or they don't, and if they don't, you find out why and you fix them. Sarabeth turned away from him and walked slowly toward the far window of the throne room. Through the thick glass, the stars of Sector Null stretched out in every direction, cold and far and indifferent. My empire, she said quietly, almost to herself, has several things that do not work. Marcus waited. She turned back to look at him. I will have you taken to suitable quarters for the journey to Velmora Prime. You will be returned safely to whatever station you came from after that. She paused. Unless you have other business in the area. I don't, Marcus said. Then I will make a proposal, she said. A technical consultancy, a short term, well compensated. Her voice was even and formal again. The Queen fully back in place. The Velshara is not the only vessel in my fleet with failing components. Marcus looked around. The throne room, the dark walls, the golden crest, the stars outside the window. He thought about the cold sandwich he had left half-eaten back on the mule. All right, he said, but I'll need access to the full engineering schematics and a proper workspace. You will have them, and I pick my own repair methods. There was a pause, a slight, almost invisible tension around her jaw. Within reason, she said. Marcus nodded. He figured that was as close to a yes as he was going to get from a queen. He turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing. He looked back at her. Thank you for the payment, both amounts. Sarabeth said nothing. But as Marcus left the throne room and the door slid shut behind him, there was something in her expression, something quiet and unreadable that had not been there when he first walked in. Velmora Prime was the kind of planet that made a person feel very small. Marcus stood at the window of his assigned quarters, a suite in the Imperial Palace that was larger than his entire ship, and looked out at the capital city below. It was enormous. Dark towers rose into a sky the color of deep ocean water. Wide bridges connected them like threads in a web. Ships moved in careful, organized lines through the air traffic lanes. Everything was precise. Everything was ordered. Everything looked like it had been built to last forever. It also looked, Marcus thought, like a place that had not changed in a very long time. He had been on Velmora Prime for 4 days. In that time, he had been given a workspace in the palace engineering wing, a large room that smelled of cold metal and machine oil, which he found immediately comfortable. He had been handed a data tablet with the schematics of 6 Imperial warships, all showing different kinds of system failures, and he had been largely left alone, which suited him fine. On the 5th day, Sarabeth walked into his workspace. Without announcement, Marcus was on the floor at the time, halfway under a section of engine housing they had brought in for him to examine. He heard the doors open and the sound of footsteps, and slid out, expecting one of the engineering staff. He found instead the Queen of the Cathari Empire standing in the middle of his workspace, looking around at the scattered tools, the open panels, the half-disassembled parts arranged in rows on the floor. "This is very disorganized," she said. "I know where everything is," Marcus said. He stood up and wiped his hands on his jacket. "Did you need something? I came to observe," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then shrugged and went back under the engine housing. "Pull up a chair," he said from underneath it. She did not pull up a chair. She stood, but she stayed. Over the next hour she watched him work, and occasionally she asked questions, precise, technical questions that told him she understood more about engineering than she let on. In public, he answered them plainly. She listened without interrupting. It was, Marcus thought, a surprisingly comfortable way to spend an afternoon. Over the following week, she came back every day. They argued often. She believed in replacement over repair. It was deep in the Cathari way of thinking, deep as bone. He believed in understanding why something had failed before deciding what to do about it. She found his methods slow. He found her methods wasteful. They went back and forth with the particular energy of two people who are used to being right and are surprised to find the other one capable of keeping up. But the work moved forward, and the ships, one by one, were improved. It was on the 10th day that Marcus noticed something else. He had been going through the maintenance logs of the Imperial fleet. A long, dry read, but he had learned years ago that the history of a machine told you more than any inspection. Deep in the data, buried under layers of official reports, he found a pattern. Supply runs to 3 vassal systems, Harith, Vorkaya, and the Delphi cluster, had been logged as completed for the past 11 years, but when he cross-referenced the actual delivery records, the numbers did not match. Resources had been allocated, marked as sent, but the records on the receiving end told a different story. The distribution network, the chain of relay stations and cargo ships that moved supplies between the core worlds and the Outer systems was broken, had been. Broken for years, not dramatically. Broken. Just quietly, slowly. Consistently failing, like a pipe with a small leak that nobody noticed until the ceiling came down. He brought it to Sarabeth that evening. She looked at the data for a long time without speaking. Then she called in 3 senior advisors and 2 imperial logistics ministers. And they looked at it too. The room got very quiet. This cannot be correct, one of the ministers said. It is correct, Marcus said. I've checked it 3 times, the relay stations at 0.7, 12, and 19 in and outer distribution chain have been operating at degraded capacity for over a decade. Cargo is being lost in transit, rerouted incorrectly, or sitting in holding patterns nobody is monitoring. The vassal worlds aren't getting what they were promised. The relay stations were serviced regularly. The minister said stiffly, they were reported as serviced, Marcus said. There's a difference, another silence. Sarabeth had not looked up from the data. Her face was very still. How long to fix it, she asked. The stations themselves, a few weeks each if I have the right crew, but the bigger fix is the monitoring system. Right now there's no automatic flag when a delivery goes wrong. You need a system that catches failures in real time and routes them for immediate review. That's a software problem. Maybe 2 weeks to build something workable. One of the advisors leaned toward the Queen and spoke quietly in Kithori. Marcus's translator caught most of it. Something about the cost of admitting the network had been broken, and what that would mean for the ministry responsible. The cost of not admitting it, Marcus said plainly, is 3 systems full of people who feel abandoned by their empire, which is probably why they're talking about leaving it. The advisor went very quiet. Sarabeth looked up from the data. She looked at Marcus with the same careful, measuring expression he had come to recognize. Then she looked at her advisors. Give him whatever he needs, she said. What followed was 6 of the most intense weeks of Marcus's professional life. He put together a small crew, unlikely, mismatched but functional. There was Tev, a Kithori engineer who had been passed over for promotion so many times he had stopped counting, and who turned out to be genuinely gifted once someone actually asked his opinion. There was Liss, an archivist who knew the Imperial data systems better than anyone and was quietly desperate for something useful to do with that knowledge. And there was a former outer system merchant named Grush, who was large, blunt, and knew every shipping lane, unofficial route, and broken relay point in the vassal territories because he had been navigating around them for years. Marcus trusted people who knew things. They worked through the relay stations remotely first, pushing software patches and rerouting commands through the network. Then Marcus and Tev took a fast courier ship out to the 3 worst physical failures and fixed them on site. Old parts, new solutions, a lot of heat bonding polymer. 6 weeks after Marcus had first pulled up those maintenance logs, a supply convoy arrived in Hyrith on time with a full load, the first one in 11 years. Reports from the vassal systems came in quickly after that. Confusion at first, then relief, then something quieter and more significant, a change in tone from the local governors, a stepping back from the sharp language that had been filling the diplomatic channels for months. The rebellions did not end But they cooled, measurably, like a fire that had been given a little water, not put out but brought down from roaring to smoldering. The Imperial Council was baffled. They had expected the outer systems to need a decade of careful political management. They had models and projections and long strategies built around it. Marcus had fixed the supply chain the night the first convoy arrived in Harith. Sarabeth found him in his workspace. Again, it was late. The palace was quiet. She came in without ceremony, without advisors, and sat in the chair. She had eventually started using the worn one in the corner that Marcus had dragged in from a storage room, and that was completely unsuitable for a queen by any reasonable standard. She sat in it. Anyway, the council does not understand what happened, she said. The council was managing a political problem. Marcus said it wasn't a political problem, it was a logistics problem. People, in my experience, prefer complicated explanations. People prefer explanations that keep them in control. He said, if the problem is political, you need politicians. If it's a broken pipe, you need a wrench. The council doesn't carry wrenches. Sarabeth was quiet for a moment. The gold eyes looked at him steadily. And you do, always, Marcus said. She looked at the workspace, the tools on the walls, the schematics pinned to the boards, the half-repaired components lined up in careful order on the tables. Her empire laid out in pieces, being put back together by a human from a second-rate salvage tug who ate cold sandwiches and argued with queens. There is something else, she said. Something larger. She paused. I was going to wait before telling you, but I find that I trust your thinking. Marcus set down the calibration tool he had been holding. He gave her his full attention. She told him about the Dravek. The Dravek ascendancy had been watching the Cathori Empire for 30 years. They were patient in the way that only old civilizations could be, the kind of patience that was not calm but calculated, the kind that waited for exactly the right crack before it pushed. They had watched the vassal systems grow restless. They had watched the Imperial Fleet without adequate upgrades. They had watched the border patrols thin out in the years when funding went elsewhere, and then without a formal declaration of war, the Dravek did not bother with formalities. They moved. 3 Cathari border fleets were hit in the same hour. The first was overwhelmed completely. The second retreated with heavy losses. The third managed to hold its position for 6 hours before pulling back to avoid destruction. By the time Sarabeth received the news in her palace on Vel Mora Prime, the Dravek had already pushed 30 light minutes into Cathari space and were still moving. Imperial Council was called into emergency session. Marcus sat in the back of the room, which he had not been invited to, but which no one had technically told him to leave. He listened for 2 hours while the most powerful military and political minds in the Empire argued. Their conclusion, reached with great seriousness and considerable ceremony, was to fall back. A full strategic withdrawal from the border regions. Let the Dravek advance into the outer territories. Begin a 100-year rebuilding plan. Protect the core worlds, accept short-term loss for long-term survival. It was logical. It was carefully reasoned. It was. Every advisor in the room agreed. The correct response. Marcus thought it was the worst idea he had ever heard. he said. So the room went very quiet in a way that rooms tended to go quiet around him these days. Several council members looked at each other. One of them started to say something about how a human consultant had no standing to let him speak. Sarabeth said from the head of the table. Her voice was flat and did not invite argument. Marcus stood up. He was still in his work jacket. He had been in the middle of a repair job when the emergency session was called. He had a grease stain on his left sleeve. A 100-year retreat tells every vassal world you just fixed that their empire abandons them when things get hard, he said. You'll lose the outer systems permanently. Not to the Dravek, just gone. Done. And 100 years from now, you won't have an empire to rebuild. We do not have the military strength to hold the border. The senior admiral said coldly. You don't need to hold the border, Marcus said. You need to make advancing past the border too expensive to be worth it. He pulled up a map of the contested zone on the room's display. 3 fingers of Dravek advance, moving inward like rivers. Between them, stretches of space filled with debris. Fields, asteroid clusters, old mining installations, decommissioned relay stations. The Dravek have never fought humans, Marcus said. They have 30 years of data on Kethori. Military doctrine, they know your formations, your response times, your standard defensive patterns. They've planned for everything you would normally do. He tapped the map. They have no data on what I would do. One of the admirals leaned forward. You are one person, I'm one person, with a repair kit and no respect for the way things are normally done, Marcus said, which is honestly more dangerous. He proposed a plan that made the admirals deeply uncomfortable. It was not a traditional defensive strategy. It did not involve forming up fleet lines and engaging in organized combat. It involved using the 3 crippled warships that the Council had already marked for scrapping vessels nobody thought were worth saving as anchors for a defensive network stretched across the asteroid clusters between the Dravek advance columns. It involved turning the old mining installations into sensor ghosts, broadcasting signals that would look like a much larger defensive force than actually existed. It involved supply lines run through routes the Dravek would consider impassable because every navigation chart in the known galaxy agreed they were impassable. The charts were wrong. Marcus had read the original survey data, and the charts were wrong by a significant margin, which meant there was a clean corridor through the Seavith cluster that nobody was using, and it involved doing all of this very quickly with whatever was on hand in ways that no military planner in the room would have considered acceptable under normal circumstances. There was a long silence after he finished. This plan, the senior admiral said carefully, relies heavily on improvisation. Yes, Marcus said, imperial military doctrine does not permit improvisation. Imperial military doctrine, Marcus said, also didn't account for a human salvage engineer, so I think we're already off the map. Sarabeth authorized the plan. She gave him 3 warships, access to the mining installations, a fast logistics crew, and a direct communication line to the fleet commanders. She gave him these things over the strong objections of half her council, and she did it with the kind of Authority that meant the objections stopped after that. Marcus went to work. The next 17 days were the most exhausting of his life. He slept in 4-hour stretches on a cot in the logistics center. He ate whatever someone handed him and drank too much coffee. The Cathori did not have coffee, but Tev had found something close that worked well enough. He redesigned the sensor network 3 times as new information came in about the Dravik advance. He argued with fleet commanders, charmed supply officers, and fixed a critical navigation system on one of the crippled warships personally while it was actively being prepared for deployment. The 3 old warships which Marcus had quietly named the first, the second, and the third because the Cathori naming system was too long to say, quickly were positioned at the narrow points between the asteroid clusters. What remained of their weapon systems were repaired, their hulls were patched. They were not fighting ships in any conventional sense, but they did not need to be. They needed to be there, visible, holding a line. The Dravik advance hit the defensive network 4 days later, and it slowed the sensor ghosts, confused their targeting the real warships in unexpected positions, forced them to stop and reassess. Supply lines through the 7th cluster meant the defensive force did not run out of ammunition or power on the timeline the Dravik had planned for. Every time the Dravik adjusted, the response they got was not what their models predicted. Cathori forces did not behave the way Cathari forces were supposed to behave because a human was telling them what to do. The advance stalled on day 11. On day 14, one of the Dravik advance columns pulled back to reorganize. On day 17, the overall advance stopped. It was not a victory. It was a breathing space. But breathing space was what the Empire had needed. Marcus was on the stubborn mule when the last Dravik column halted. He had taken her out to check a relay beacon that had gone quiet in the outer edge of the defensive line. The mule was not a warship. She had no weapons. She was a salvage tug with a magnetic docking clamp and a very stubborn engine, but she was fast and she was small, and she moved through tight spaces that larger ships couldn't manage. He was on his way back when the proximity alert fired a Dravik strike craft, fast single pilot, the kind used for precision hits, had come through the asteroid field on a route that should have been covered by a sensor post. The sensor post had failed. Marcus knew it had failed because he had been going out to fix it. The strike craft was not targeting him. It was targeting the troop transport 3,000 km. Behind him, a Cathori ship carrying 2,000 soldiers toward the defensive line. There was a brief and very clear moment where Marcus understood exactly what was about to happen and exactly what his options were. He pushed the stubborn mule to full throttle and put her between the strike craft and the transport. The mule took the hit across her port side. The explosion threw her sideways and blew out every system on the left half of the ship. Marcus hit the emergency bulkhead seal, cut power to the damaged sections, and managed to keep the core hull intact through what could only be described as a combination of good engineering and extremely aggressive button pressing. The troop transport survived the Dravik strike craft, having expended its main weapon, and now in the middle of active sensor coverage, turned and ran. The stubborn mule drifted. Her systems were mostly dark. Her port engine was gone. She was alive just barely. the way things Marcus cared about tended to stay alive, and Marcus himself was alive, though his left arm was burned from a conduit rupture, and he was going to have an impressive bruise along his ribs. For weeks, he sat on the floor of the tilted bridge in the dark and the quiet, and breathed. His emergency beacon was already transmitting. The first ship to dock with him was not a rescue vessel. It was small, fast, and bore the Imperial seal. When the airlock opened, and Sarabeth stepped through alone in full armor, moving quickly, Marcus understood that she had come herself. She crossed the damaged bridge in a few strides and crouched down to where he was sitting against the wall. She looked at his arm, she looked at his face. Her gold eyes were very steady, but there was something moving behind them that was not as steady at all. You took the hit, she said. The transport had 2,000 people on it, Marcus said. You had one, then the math was easy, he said. She was quiet for a moment. The mule groaned around them. Somewhere in the ship, something small and broken clinked against the floor. Your ship is badly damaged, Sarabeth said. Marcus looked around at the dark walls of the mule, his ship, his home. The only thing in the galaxy that was entirely his. She'll hold, he said. She always hold. Sarabeth said nothing, but she sat down on the floor of the tilted bridge beside him, the queen of the oldest empire in this part of the galaxy, sitting on the floor of a broken salvage tug in the middle of a war zone. And she stayed there while the rescue crews came and the ships were secured. And the battle for now was done. The ceasefire came 12 days after the drawback advance stopped. It was not the end of the conflict. Everyone understood that the drawback had not been defeated. They had been slowed, surprised, and made to understand that the Cathori Empire was not the open door they had expected to walk through. They pulled back to regroup and sent a diplomatic signal, requesting a temporary halt in hostilities. Sarabeth accepted it not because she trusted the drawback, but because it gave her time, and time was what she needed most. The vassal systems held. Harith sent a formal statement of support to the imperial capital, the first in 6 years. Vorkaya offered to contribute 3 of its own patrol ships to the border defense. The Delmi cluster stayed quiet, which after the past year was as close to positive news as anyone had expected. The empire was not fixed, but it was standing, and it was standing differently than before, more firmly, with better weight distribution, like a structure that had been quietly reinforced without anyone realizing the work was happening. The Imperial Council called it a historic achievement. They held a formal ceremony. Several medals were issued. Long speeches were made in the grand hall of the palace about Cathori strength and imperial resilience. Marcus was not at the ceremony. He was in the palace hangar, lying under the stubborn mule, reattaching the port thruster assembly. With a socket wrench and a lot of patience, the mule had been brought in and repaired in the 2 weeks since the battle. Tev and his team had rebuilt the port engine from salvaged components. Not original parts, not expensive replacements, but solid, reliable work that would hold. The hull had been patched, the systems had been restored. She was not pristine. She never had been, but she flew, and her lights came on, and the engine turned over steady and clean when Marcus ran the test cycle. He was tightening the last bolt on the thruster mount when he heard footsteps. He slid out from under the ship, Sarabeth stood in the hangar. She was alone. No guards, no advisors, no court. She was wearing armor, but the formal crown band was absent. She looked more than he had ever seen her. Looked like a person rather than a title. She looked at the mule for a moment. She is repaired, Sarabeth said. Mostly, Marcus said. She'll need a few weeks before I'd take her through anything rough. But she'll fly, Sarabeth nodded slowly. She walked around the front of the ship, examining the hull, the new patches, the old ones, the scars from years of hard use, and one recent act of considerable stupidity. She stopped at the port side, where the worst of the damage had been. We scanned this ship, she said. After the battle, a full structural analysis, looking for weaknesses, Marcus asked. Looking for answers, she said. Every repair you have ever made to this vessel is visible in the scan. Every patch, every seal, every improvised fix going back years. She paused. None of them have failed. Marcus leaned against the mule's hull, with his arms crossed. She's a good ship. The materials are substandard, Sarabeth said plainly. The components are mismatched. The repairs do not follow any standard methodology. And yet the ship holds better in many places than the original construction. She turned to look at him. Why? He thought about it honestly, the way he always tried to think about things. Because I cared whether they worked, he said. Every time I fixed something on this ship, it mattered, not just as a job. She's mine. She carries me home. When I seal a breach, I seal it like it has to last, because for me, it has to last. Sarabeth was quiet. The hangar was large and still around them, the kind of quiet that exists in big spaces late in the day. The Kath Ori do not think this way. She said, we build for permanence. When something fails, we do not believe it can be made trustworthy again. A broken thing is a failed thing. It is removed. She paused. I have run an empire by that principle my entire life. And how has that worked out? Marcus asked. Not unkindly, just directly. She almost smiled. It was a small thing, a shift at the corner of her mouth, barely visible, but Marcus had been watching her face for months and he caught it. The council has offered you reward, she said, changing direction, title, land, compensation. I am told you asked for spare parts. Mule needed them, Marcus said. You are a very strange person, she said, with something in her voice that was not quite an insult. I've been told. She walked back toward him and stopped a few feet away. Her gold eyes were direct and serious. This, Marcus had come to understand, was how she looked when she was about to say something that cost her something to say. I have something to ask you, she said. It is not an official proposal. It is not a contract or a consultancy or a transaction of any kind. She paused. I have found that I do not know how to make this kind of request because I have never made one before. Marcus waited. The Empire needs more than repairs to its ships and its supply chains, she said. It needs someone who looks at broken things and asks why they broke, rather than how to replace them. Someone who is not afraid of imperfection. Someone who asks uncomfortable questions and does not stop asking them when the room goes quiet. She met his eyes. I need that person close, not as an employee, not as a subject. A pause, careful and deliberate. I do not have a word in my language for what I am asking. The closest translation would be Something like an equal, someone who stands beside. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. The gold eyes were steady, the tall, still careful queen of a very old empire asking something she did not entirely have words for because her language had apparently never needed the word before. You're asking me to stay? He said. Yes, she said. Simply. Finally, the hangar was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a ship was moving through the sky. Its engine a low distant hum. The mule sat warm and patched behind him. Marcus thought about Sector Null. He thought about the cold sandwich. He thought about the blinking light he had been going to ignore, and the enormous broken ship in the dark, and a bleeding queen in damaged armor, who had watched him patch a plasma conduit with a polymer strip and had never quite looked at things the same way since. I'm going to need a bigger workshop, he said. This time she did smile. It was a real one, not large, not dramatic, but genuine, and it changed her whole face in a way that the throne and the crown and the formal armor had always hidden. I will have one built, she said, and I'm keeping the mule in the hangar. I assumed as much, and I'm still going to tell you when I think you're wrong. I know, she said. That is part of why I am asking. He nodded. She nodded. It was not a ceremony. There were no speeches, no council members, no golden crests or formal proceedings. Just two people in a hangar coming to an understanding the way practical people tended to, directly, without unnecessary decoration. In the weeks that followed, the stubborn mule was given a permanent berth in the royal hangar, a golden crest, the imperial seal of the Ori Empire, was painted on her starboard side, small and clean at Marcus's request, not covering the old patches, not hiding the scars, placed alongside them the way a mark of belonging sits alongside a mark of history. The mule looked, if anything, more herself with it there. Marcus's workshop was built in the east wing of the palace, larger than he had asked for, with better tools than he had expected, and a window that looked out over the capital city. Tev was given an official position and a title that took 4 syllables to say. Lee stayed on, managing an information network that Marcus had quietly suggested and Sarabeth had quietly agreed to fund. Grush came and went as he always had, running supply corridors that were now officially sanctioned and considerably more profitable. The Empire kept its problems. Old things did not stop being complicated just because someone had started paying attention to them. The Dravek kept their distance but not their silence. The council kept its habits and its pride. There were hard days and long arguments, and moments that required more patience than Marcus naturally had, but the supply chains ran. The relay station stayed online. The fleet was slowly, imperfectly, stubbornly improved, and when something broke, when it cracked or leaked or failed in the way things always eventually do, there was someone whose first question was not, when can we replace this, but why did this break? And how do we fix it? That question, Marcus had always believed, was the most important question in the universe. He still believed it. And now, for the first time, he had someone beside him who was beginning to believe it too. The stubborn mule sat in the royal hangar, patched and battered and marked with the crest of an empire, and she did not look out of place. She looked exactly like something that had found where it belonged.